Morning, everyone. This hearing will come to order. This morning, we are here to talk about strategic sourcing and what it means for small business. Strategic sourcing is in itself neither good nor bad. It's a tool. It is how we use it that matters. It isn't the hammer's fault that someone uses it to cure a headache. Rather, strategic sourcing at its heart is about being smarter about how we buy things. It means knowing what goods and services we are currently buying, who is buying these goods and services, who are buying them from, and where they are in turn acquiring these goods and services. It means understanding what we actually mean rather than what we need rather than what we are buying. It means clearly communicating those needs to the marketplace. It means being aware of the ways the marketplace may change, either in what new products and services are becoming available or what other forces are operating in that market. When you're talking about the federal government, an entity that spends $516 billion throughout the year, it also means understanding that the way we buy things may irrevocably change that market. This leads to challenges we are here to discuss and address. Excuse me. How can the government buy smarter and realize the benefits small businesses bring to the table? I know I don't need to remind anyone here that small businesses are our job creators and innovators, or that the competition they bring to the government marketplace drives down costs and keeps our industrial base healthy. If we do strategic sourcing well, it can benefit small businesses and taxpayers alike. If we simply use strategic sourcing as a synonym for contract bundling and consolidation, it may undermine that industrial base. In federal contracting, we have winners and losers. No one is advocating that every business is entitled to a contract. However, the government shouldn't act in a way that keeps small businesses from competing. Likewise, we cannot contract in a way that forces the majority of contractors out of the market for a long period of time and then expect those same businesses to be there when we need them. Make no mistake, we will need them to offer competition for the incumbent contractors if we want long-term savings. I hope our witnesses today will discuss both the long-term and short-term effects of strategic sourcing. Additionally, as we discussed at our last hearing, not every method of procurement is suited for every type of purchase. The more complicated the good or service being bought, the harder it is to commoditize it. Given our standard, strategic sourcing of services poses special challenges for small businesses. Therefore, I hope our witnesses will address which types of goods and services are suitable for strategic outsourcing. Truly strategic outsourcing is simply a quest for not simply a quest for the lowest price at any moment. It requires an understanding of the long-term dynamics of the marketplace and the power wielded by the buyer. As the Undersecretary of Defense recently wrote, the first responsibility of acquisition workforce is to think. I hope today's hearing will help clarify the issues surrounding strategic sourcing so that the government does not act in a penny-wise and pound-foolish manner. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today, and I turn to Ms. Ming for her opening statement. Ranking Member Ming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. Our committee has long acknowledged the critical role small businesses play in the $500 billion a year federal marketplace. When small firms are awarded contracts for government agencies, the result is a win-win. The government receives good value for their money as small companies have the dexterity to provide high-quality goods and services at competitive prices. That means taxpayers' resources are spent wisely. Not only do the agencies benefit by using small businesses, but the economy does as well. Equally important, unlike larger businesses, small businesses must often add staff to meet government demand for their products and services, which results in further job creation. With our economy continuing to recover, it is vital that we pursue every mechanism possible to foster job creation by the federal government, and that extends to the procurement process. As more federal agencies adopt the strategic sourcing initiative, Questions are arising about whether the SSI promotes competition and fosters small business participation in the federal marketplace. With 19 agencies moving to make SSI mandatory, many small firms are starting to suffer. One analysis focused exclusively on suppliers of office products. It found that on average, small firms previously competing under the GSA schedule for this business lost anywhere between $20,000 and $10 million in revenue. The committee has heard from a number of entrepreneurs who suggested that these changes are already resulting in layoffs. If SSI is hurting small businesses and the economy, we must examine this issue closely. I want to make sure businesses like Data Conversion Laboratory in Fresh Meadows, New York, or Defender Security Services in Regal Park, New York, are still able to compete for federal contracts on the same playing field they are today. Small firms not included in the blanket purchasing agreement tell us they find themselves effectively locked out of a $1.4 billion market. In the meantime, large corporations like OfficeMax and Staples are expanding their presence in the federal marketplace. If small firms that previously won contracts through the GSA schedule are being denied the opportunity to compete, even when they could provide the same goods at a lower price, then we have to wonder whether SSI functions as intended. There are also concerns about whether SSI is sacrificing long-term competitiveness in order to reduce short-term costs. If the vast majority of small business contractors are not chosen to participate in SSI, and as a result stop bidding on federal work, will agencies have fewer options in the future? And when prices begin creeping up, wouldn't we want a larger pool of small firms to compete for a right to deliver these goods and services? Without a diverse range of companies in the federal market, we may find that over the long term, SSI has failed to reduce prices, but instead reduce the number of firms participating in the process. Setting aside questions about how this initiative impacts entrepreneurs, it is important that SSI not be used as a one-size-fits-all approach to procurement. What works for the purchase of physical products may be ill-suited for contracts related to services. Similarly, not every agency may find SSI to be a good match. Media reports suggest agencies are feeling increasing pressure to adopt the SSI standards for all purchasing decisions. Although it remains to be seen whether SSI saves the taxpayer money, it seems intuitive that if there are savings, the program should be applied only where it works, while the former GSA schedule should remain intact where it keeps costs low and quality high. All of this is not to say that the SSI program is without merit. We certainly don't want agencies using less efficient and more expensive procurement processes. However, if small firms that have been offering quality services are being locked out, even having to let go of staff, then it may be time to take a hard look at whether this initiative is achieving the desired result. On that note, I look forward and thank the witnesses for being here and thank them for shedding light on this critical topic. I yield back my time.
Thank you. You each have 5 minutes. The light will go yellow, then red. We'll be lenient. We want to know what you have to say. So with that, our first witness here today is Mr. Stan Z. Soloway. Mr. Soloway is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Professional Service Council, the National Trade Association of Government Professionals and Technical Service Industry. Prior to joining PSC in 2001, Mr. Soloway served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense directing acquisition reform. Mr. Soloway, thank you for being here. You may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Ming. Thanks for the opportunity to testify and to share our views on the potential impacts on small business of the federal government's strategic sourcing initiatives. This is a matter of significant interest to our community, given both the unique diversity of our membership base and the equally unique diversity of the services our members provide to the federal government. Our membership of over 360 companies is comprised of firms of all sizes, including approximately 25% that are classified as small businesses and an additional 25 or 30% that would be classified as small mid-tier firms. It's this diversity of function and size that provides the lens through which we view strategic sourcing and the full range of business policies we address with the Congress and the administration and how they will impact all or portions of the federal services sector. In our view, structured properly, the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative has the potential to deliver real benefits for Federal agencies and taxpayers alike. As such, we commend the Office of Federal Procurement Policy for making strategic sourcing a priority. Yet while we fully support the FISI's intended objectives, we do have some concerns about its practical effects. And those concerns relate more to the way in which the term is used and understood rather than to the concept itself. So along those lines, I'd like to make a few overarching observations and conclude with 4 specific recommendations. First, we need to be clear that strategic sourcing is not one thing. It is a set of multi-layered, flexible procurement strategies that evolve and change depending on the nature and complexity of what is being bought. For pure commodities where cost is the primary, even sole concern, strategic sourcing can be fairly simple. For more complex needs, particularly higher-end services where quality and technical ability become more central to a decision, the challenges and complexities also grow substantially. For products where place of performance or production is irrelevant, strategic sourcing may mean one thing, whereas for services where the place of performance is highly relevant, the need to deliver services across multiple geographic regions can bring with it a different set of issues and challenges, especially for small business. These variations are not insignificant, and as the Government Accountability Office found in their recent report on strategic sourcing, are key elements of the way strategic sourcing is implemented in the private sector. Our concern is not that the senior leadership is unaware of these critical variations. In fact, we believe they understand them very well. But that the front line, where we are seeing an increased commoditization of even the most complex needs, there are too many people who believe that the term really refers solely to an aggregation of buying for scale to drive down unit costs. Unless and until that frontline awareness and understanding is improved and enhanced, we do have concerns that FISI could generate a range of unintended consequences. Second, strategic sourcing raises a seminal question. Is our principal objective and responsibility to optimize government operations, or is it to optimize those operations without impacting the current environment for small disadvantaged, hump zone, veteran-owned, or small woman-owned businesses? For example, is it better to have fewer small businesses receiving a higher volume of work from the government, or a larger number of small businesses with smaller shares of the volume? Is it more important to perpetuate the long-standing tenet of fiscal acquisition in which broad, continuous, open competition is a primary goal? Or is it more important to seek optimization which almost by definition would reduce the pool of suppliers of both products and services? These are far more than rhetorical questions. They and their disposition is essential to assessing the future of FISI. To their credit, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council recognize this dichotomy and have worked hard to factor it into their planning, but a much broader conversation is very much needed. These issues have also been prominent in the discussion about GSA's OASIS solicitation. Among the concerns that it has raised is that it will reduce the number of small business opportunities and that it is overly, if not principally, focused on driving down the unit cost of complex professional services, and less so on overall value, quality, and performance. Indeed, some GSA officials stated repeatedly in public forums that driving down unit cost was their principal goal. To GSA's credit, it has conducted extensive outreach to the private sector, and it does appear that they've taken to heart many of the comments they have received. But even as we await GSA's publication of the final OASIS solicitation and their explanation of how they reconciled competing policy and competitive interests, concern still exists as to how the competition and implementation of the awards will ultimately play out. With all of this in mind, let me just make 4 basic recommendations for the road forward. First, if I could define one desired outcome from this hearing, it would be to gain much more clarity on the question of whether the balance between the number of small business providers and the total dollars expended with small business is aligned with both the administration's and Congress's small business agenda. There is little doubt about the effectiveness of recent strategic sourcing for wireless services, laptops, and office supplies. Consensus on that alignment is essential to the effective and efficient expansion of strategic sourcing, however far it may go. OFPP and the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council recognize this dichotomy, have worked hard to factor it into their planning, but as I said earlier, that conversation needs to be expanded. Second, we should develop and deploy requisite training tools to the workforce without delay and require that all acquisition personnel involved in any specific strategic sourcing effort for other than the most basic commodities first complete that training. Third, we should be highly judicious in the use of strategic sourcing for services, particularly for complex services. We should require senior-level review of significant strategic sourcing efforts for services to ensure that the strategies being employed are clearly articulated and are not overly focused on simply forcing down labor rates at the expense of overall quality. And finally, we should pursue a flexible rather than overly prescriptive strategic sourcing initiative. Let's allow individual agencies some degree of flexibility to pursue their own agency-unique initiatives and to develop performance measures for both agency-specific and government-wide initiatives that will meaningfully inform the future shape, expansion, and/or limitations of the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Ming, the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative has great potential, but also requires careful attention. Absent answers to the questions above, it is frankly not possible to say with certainty what its impact on small business will be. The Office of Federal Procurement Policy, the SSLC, GSA, and others are to be congratulated for their relentless efforts to ensure that Federal agencies buy smart and buy well. And we remain fully committed to working with them and with you and with individual agencies to ensure that we find the right balance and ensure the best possible performance on behalf of the taxpayer. Thank you once again for the opportunity to be here today, and I certainly look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Any members that have written statements may submit them for the record. Our second witness is Mr. Robert A. Burton. Mr. Burton is Senior Partner for the Venable LLP in Washington, D.C., where he is a nationally recognized federal procurement attorney. Prior to joining Venable, Mr. Burton spent 7 years at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, serving as Deputy Administrator as well as Acting Administrator for 2 years. Mr. Burton, you may begin.
Chairman Hanna and Ranking Member Ming, I very much appreciate the opportunity today to discuss what I term the unintended effects of strategic sourcing on small businesses. Prior to joining the Venable Law Firm in 2008, I did serve as the Deputy Administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, referred to as OFPP. While serving in this capacity, I was closely involved with the first government-wide strategic sourcing initiative and the development of the 2005 Office of Management and Budget Memorandum on Strategic Sourcing, which, for the very first time, directed agencies to develop and implement appropriate strategic sourcing efforts. A lot of discussion with agency acquisition officials and small business advocates preceded the issuance of the 2005 Strategic Sourcing Policy Memorandum. The consensus was that any agency-specific or government-wide strategic sourcing initiative had to be focused not only on lowering the price of goods and services, but also increasing the value of each taxpayer dollar spent. This meant that agency strategic sourcing efforts had to improve the quality of performance and increase small business participation. We quickly learned that strategic sourcing is not a simple concept. Rather, it requires careful analysis, planning, and implementation. We rolled out the first government-wide strategic sourcing initiative for express and domestic delivery services because very few vendors provide these specialized services. No small businesses were impacted, and it was relatively easy for the government to effectively leverage its combined buying power for these services. But as we explored the use of other government-wide strategic sourcing vehicles, it became much more challenging, and small businesses expressed concerns with the use of government-wide strategic sourcing vehicles. Specifically, they were concerned that the consolidation of contracting vehicles across government would reduce competition and opportunities for small businesses. Today, existing and proposed government-wide strategic sourcing vehicles highlight some of the negative effects strategic sourcing can have on small businesses. For example, GSA's recently proposed strategic sourcing vehicle for janitorial and sanitation supplies, commonly referred to as JanSan, manifests several legitimate concerns of small businesses. First, nothing in the JanSan strategic sourcing vehicle guarantees that small businesses will receive any significant contract dollars, even if they are awarded a blanket purchase agreement or BPA. Although GSA has set aside 8 of 15 JanSan BPAs for small businesses, such set-asides do not necessarily guarantee small business success. Simply put, agencies are not required to place orders under the small business set-aside BPAs. Second, JanSan will reduce the pool of approximately 540 small business contractors that provide the government with janitorial supplies. Under JanSan, a total of only 15 BPAs can be awarded. This means that hundreds of vendors will be foreclosed from contracting with the government. This will be especially true if agencies are mandated to use the JanSan vehicle. Currently, small business vendors who fail to win a government-wide strategic sourcing contracting opportunity have the ability to maintain their businesses by competing on GSA schedule contracts or participating in other forms of open competition. The Jansan example highlights the importance of not making government-wide strategic sourcing vehicles mandatory for use by the agencies. And this is why OFPP did not make strategic sourcing vehicles mandatory in 2005 when we announced the first government-wide strategic sourcing effort. The mandatory use of a single strategic sourcing vehicle will reduce contracting opportunities for small businesses and the pool of small business contractors, even if the vehicle incorporates small business set-asides and achieves small business goals. Finally, the government strategic sourcing initiative was designed not only to increase small business participation, but also to ensure best value. The emphasis on value is a cornerstone of strategic sourcing. As discussed in the 2005 OMB Strategic Sourcing Memorandum, agencies were to maximize the value of every dollar spent through strategic sourcing. Because some of the current strategic sourcing vehicles are constructed as low-price, technically acceptable procurements, the government is emphasizing price at the expense of overall value. In conclusion, the government should carefully plan and implement proposed strategic sourcing vehicles to ensure that savings are not achieved at the expense of small businesses and value for the taxpayers. This is particularly true in cases where cost savings may be short-term and eliminated in the long run because of less competition and fewer small business contractors. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I will be pleased to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Our third witness today is Mr. Roger Walden. Mr. Walden is President of the Coalition for Government Procurement. He has over 25 years of government contracting experience, including a 20-year tenure at the General Services Administration, where he held various positions, including Acting Director, Chief Acquisition Officer. Mr. Walden, you may begin.
Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Ming, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to address putting the strategy in sourcing, challenge and opportunities for small business contractors. The Coalition for Government Procurement is a nonprofit association of firms selling commercial services and products to the Federal Government. Coalition members include small, medium, and large business concerns from across the country. Coalition members account for approximately 50% of the commercial solutions purchased annually by the Federal Government and focus much of their access to the Federal marketplace through their GSA schedule contracts. Effectively used, the GSA Schedules Program is a highly successful strategic source for the government to leverage the marketplace and achieve its socioeconomic goals. Year in and year out, the GSA Schedules Program is one of the most successful government-wide small business contracting programs available. In a typical fiscal year, over 30% of the dollar volume of purchases under the GSA Schedules Program goes to small business concerns. The fundamental keys to success of the GSA Schedules Program for small business are, 1, continuous open seasons, and 2, ordering procedures and electronic tools that allow customer agencies to consider socioeconomic status when competing and placing orders. Although the Coalition generally supports the government's strategic sourcing efforts, we have a number of concerns about the impact of GSA's current acquisition strategies on businesses of all sizes, but particularly on small companies. Last year, GSA proposed a demand-based model that would have eliminated continuous open seasons under the GSA Schedules Program. The Coalition submitted comments opposing the closure of GSA schedules to new offers. A copy of our comments are attached to our written testimony. Coalition members remain uniformly opposed to closing the GSA Schedule Program to new offers, as it would inhibit and limit opportunities for small businesses, restrict competition, and inhibit access to commercial innovation by the government. We are concerned that GSA's strategic sourcing initiatives are being used to implement the demand-based model's closure of GSA schedules to new offers. At the same time, the government is moving towards a mandatory use contracting model for blanket purchase agreements established under the GSA Schedules Program. Mandatory use will have the unintended long-term consequence of reducing opportunities for small businesses. By its very nature, mandatory use limits access of the federal buyer to a small group of contractors. Mandatory use will restrict access to the federal marketplace for small businesses. Rather than imposing mandatory use terms as a means of leveraging the government's volume, the Coalition supports use of volume commitments or guaranteed minimums that are based on improved requirements development, which is, after all, commercial practice. Volume commitments create the economic incentives to offer lower prices for commercial solutions. At the same time, the government maintains the flexibility to access a commercial marketplace and compete opportunities for small businesses. It is a win-win for government and industry. The Coalition is also concerned that the current approach to strategic sourcing includes the use of generic, government-wide blanket purchase agreements established under the GSA Schedules program, agreements that do not include specific requirements or volume commitments upon which effective competition can be based. The intermediate step of establishing such agreements results in vertical contract duplication that increases bid and proposal costs for government and industry and definitely hurts small business. These agreements should be limited to the maximum extent practicable. Agencies should compete task orders establish blanket purchase agreements under the GSA Schedules program based on specific requirements, including volume commitments. This approach will enhance rational, realistic competition, competitive pricing, and improved efficiency. A program of agency-specific blanket purchase agreements established under the GSA Schedule program will also provide greater opportunities for small business concerns. In summary, when effectively used, the GSA Schedules program is a highly successful strategic source for government. At the same time, GSA Schedule contracts are a powerful marketing tool for small business concerns when dealing with contracting offices across federal, state, and local governments. However, it appears that rather than focusing on the strengths of the program, its openness and access to the commercial marketplace, its flexible, streamlined ordering procedures and electronic tools, the current strategic sourcing approach closes the GSA marketplace, reduces competition, and limits access to commercial solutions and small business. The Coalition for Government Procurement is pleased to submit our written testimony for the record, and we stand ready to provide you with any additional input you may request. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. I yield to Ranking Member Meng to introduce the next witness.
It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Trey Hodgkins. Mr. Hodgkins is the Senior Vice President of the Global Public Sector at Tech America. Tech America represents over 34,000 member businesses in the information and communications technology industry, including many small businesses. Mr. Hodgkins is a recognized expert in procurement, cybersecurity, and national security, and he has over 30 years of experience in the federal, state, and local government arenas. Welcome, Mr. Hodgkins.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Ming. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank you for letting us represent some of the challenges and opportunities small businesses face in the adoption of strategic sourcing by the federal government. Tech America is uniquely positioned representing technology companies from the IT, communications, and defense industrial-based sectors, and our members range from large companies whose names are common household terms to the most innovative and agile of small technology companies from across the nation. While many of the companies are oriented with the government as a customer, a large number of our members are completely outside of the public sector and are commercial in nature, offering commercial items developed and manufactured in a global economy and distributed and sold around the world. The ubiquitous nature and complexity of the goods and services our members sell create unique perspectives on strategic sourcing in federal government contracting, and I would like to share a few of those this morning. Before I turn to that issue, however, I'd like to touch on something the Chairman noted in his opening remarks, that the biggest challenge to small businesses today in the public sector market is the tidal wave of government-unique requirements they face and the burdens those requirements create as they try to enter the market or stay in the market. Many of the commercial companies mentioned above consider the burden too significant and not worth the costs and risks and choose to simply forego government work entirely. This condition means that the government does not have access to many of the most innovative companies offering cutting-edge technologies and software products and services focused on critical issues like cybersecurity. The condition also results in diminished competition and higher prices for the goods and services the government unique requirement the government does acquire, because the burdens created by the government unique requirements end up as part of the cost of doing business and are passed along to the buyer. To address this and other conditions that hinder achieving best value for the taxpayer, Tech America would solicit the committee's support for a wholesale review of government acquisition, similar in scope and objective to the Section 800 panel convened in the early 90s. Without such an effort, we are concerned that legislative and administrative attempts to address shortcomings in Federal acquisition will only have limited impact at the edges of the issue. As tax-paying corporate citizens who employ millions of people around the country, the members of Tech America are supportive of efforts like the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative that can derive savings by consolidating the acquisition of commoditized goods. We would caution, however, that such efforts have diminishing success when goods and services of a complex or diverse nature are shoehorned into these vehicles. Strategic sourcing works best when the offering is relatively uniform, and that is simply not the way the government buys information technology goods and services. Many of the products and services in the ICT space do not lend themselves well to strategic sourcing. Government does not buy technology in a consistent fashion either, and that further complicates any effort to fit them into such an initiative. For hardware items like laptops or servers, the government does not buy them in large quantities, and when they buy them, they do not ask for a consistent configuration. One customer wants more memory, another wants a CAC card reader, and a third wants a different size screen. The one acquisition solution, for small businesses, we see two direct and immediate challenges under the Strategic Sourcing Initiative. Many of these companies will face diminished access to the Federal government market because under FSSI, there will be less award winners and more losers. The second challenge impacts those small businesses that are the most innovative providers of IT goods and services, which are frequently offered in response to narrow, unique mission requirements or as a specialized component to a broader prime contractor activity. The offerings of these companies simply do not fit into the commoditized labor categories envisioned under strategic sourcing, and these companies will face increased market pressures given the requirements to drive more and more acquisitions into strategic sourcing. The OASIS GWAC was originally proposed as a new vehicle specifically for the acquisition of complex integrations of technology and services, but it was announced earlier this year that it would become part of the FSSI and the goods and services offered under the contract would be commoditized. As noted above, complex and specialized goods and services, like the ones small technology businesses can deliver, do not lend themselves well to strategic sourcing, so industry reacted with confusion and apprehension about proceeding with the offering. While we await the solicitation to be completed, questions remain about how goods and services will be commoditized in the future under this contract vehicle. Small businesses can and should compete for contracts in FSSI, but not all goods and services lend themselves to strategic sourcing. Congress should ensure that small business opportunities to offer innovative and unique goods and specialized services are preserved and that we strike a balance as we implement the FSSI. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. For each of you, I mean, clearly there's general agreement that there's problems with the system. I was surprised, Mr. Burton, to hear that people can be awarded a contract and never be the beneficiary of anything of that contract. And Mr. Walden, you said the same thing. Without minimums, it's a particular, so that it's possible to put an enormous amount of work in bidding these, understanding them, and then being successful, being pleased with that success, and come to nothing. For both of you, do you think that's, does that make any sense, and would you change that so that there was a guaranteed minimum?
Mr. Chairman, historically, the government has really pushed back on guaranteed minimums. I think that will be difficult to do. There's a strong history of not doing that. But it is one thing the private sector does quite well, and that is a distinction between really private sector procurement and government procurement. Especially in the area of strategic sourcing, we see companies using guaranteed minimums. I certainly think that's something that could be explored. But I do think that the larger problem is the fact that even if you're successful, even if the government meets its small business goals, even if some of those businesses get a fair amount of work, the small business community as a whole is negatively impacted, and you are going to reduce the base of small businesses competing. And my biggest concern for the government is 5 years from now, when some of these vehicles come up from competition, will any small businesses, how many small businesses will be around to compete, and will the prices go up at that point in time? So I think one of the biggest concerns, Mr. Chairman, is short-term savings balanced against maybe long-term increased costs and a reduced small business base. And that's true even if the small businesses are awarded opportunities on the BPAs.
Yes, I would say during my time at GSA, we actually used guaranteed minimums, and we used them effectively for orders under the GSA Schedules program and for blanket purchase agreements. It enhanced competition, it created opportunity, and created the right economic incentives for scheduled contractors to provide price reductions at the order level during competition. I think one of the biggest challenges that the government and with the use of the GSA schedules is this growth of these sort of generic BPAs. So you can think of it as, I think of it and characterize it as vertical contract duplication. So you have the GSA schedule contract. The intent with those contracts is to compete task orders or compete BPAs and establish those for BPAs generally for recurring requirements. Okay, but what happens is, what has happened and exploded over the last few years is you'll have the GSA schedule contract, then the agency or the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative will have a generic BPA with no guarantee of usage, as Rob mentioned, and you have to, and as a company, you have to compete and expend funds to get that on that BPA, because then they're eventually going to compete orders under the BPA. So you have sort of three competitive events: the award of the schedule, the award of the generic BPA, and then an actual competition for the real requirement at the task order level. Our members are very concerned about this growth in complexity of process. Would much rather see competition for orders, at the order level, and skip this intermediate process.
Interesting. Do you the subjective nature, the more complicated the good or service that is being purchased, particularly Mr. Hodgkins, do you think that it's being handled appropriately, and do you believe that the people who are involved in designing the purchase orders or the bidding documents have an appropriate handle or balance? Obviously, some of you do not feel they have the right balance between ensuring long-term competition and making their job easier by limiting that competition. Is there in government a natural momentum to deal with those people those companies that are larger, those industries that are more available to you, as opposed to looking at the long-term goal, which is to ensure vibrant competition and yet competent competition?
Mr. Chairman, I think you perhaps are correct. There is a tendency to move toward companies that the government is used to dealing with. That's one of the challenges small businesses face. They're not necessarily a known name in the market. But the complexities around information technology, we believe that there is a dearth of organic experience in the acquisition workforce in general around technologies and market trends, and that puts the government at a disadvantage when it's buying those things. Additionally, when you look at issues like cybersecurity and you're trying to drill down on specific capabilities or counter a specific risk, small businesses frequently can step in and offer those kinds of things that a large company, they may come in as a subcontractor to a large company, or they may come in with a unique capability of their own. But I think that companies do have the ability, or the government rather has trended toward using larger companies, but that's not to say that they're cutting out the small businesses.
Thank you. I'll yield to
Mr. Chairman, may I make
yeah.
I'm sorry, Director, may I make
Certainly.
a comment on that? I think it might be helpful to step back, because I think the question you asked is really a critical one. I think, first of all, if you look at the available data and you look across different market sectors, the trends relative to your question are different in different spaces. We see in certain markets in our membership, that our membership works in, where the government is entirely setting aside entire categories of work, which almost amounts to an industrial policy, where we're saying, okay, if you're a small business, you want to work with us, that's where we're going to let you work, but no place else. And if you're not a small business and you do that work, we're not interested. That's not a very healthy balance either. I think the second piece is that when we talk about can strategic sourcing work, does it do this or whatever, I want to come back to one of the key points I tried to make in the testimony, which is strategic sourcing is not one thing. And so I think the issue that concerns us, and I think Trey was probably referring to also, is that there is a tendency across government today to look at everything through the prism of driving down a unit cost, rather than stepping back and looking at overall value, performance, and so forth. And the higher up the chain you go of complexity, the more that becomes a problematic strategy. And so strategic sourcing, you can strategically source the most complex requirements on the planet. But in that case, you would not be doing it on the basis of lower unit price. You would be doing it on the basis of technical quality, technical history, past performance, all of these other sort of discriminators that may not be as applicable when you're doing it for simple commodities. So it's a continuum, it's a spectrum, it's not one thing, and I think our concern is that it's too often seen in just one category, through one lens.
So it isn't at all surprising to anybody here, I imagine, that people seek to make their job easier rather than less complex, and the more difficult the job, the less likely that people are capable of understanding the scope and depth of it and breadth of it.
Well, and that's a general acquisition challenge we face in government.
So
but
how would you change that? What would you?
Well, I think there's a lot of education and training and development issues at stake here, and it's not just around strategic sourcing, but it's a good example. If you went across the 360-plus member companies that we represent and asked them what their number one concern is today in the federal market, small, medium, or large company would say that everything's being bought on the basis of the low price, not on the basis of quality and value, because it's a workforce that not only doesn't have the tools, but frankly, they're not encouraged to do that. No one ever got an award for paying a little bit more for something because they thought it might have better long-term value. When we think about price at the government level, we think about how much does it cost to operate this system. When Walmart thinks about price, they think about what is the impact on the entire company's supply chain and ability to stock shelves. So they look on an enterprise level rather than on the immediate level. So there's a lot of education and training involved here. I think it's wrapped up. Strategic sourcing is just one part of a bigger set of challenges. But I guess my point is that strategic sourcing of complex services makes eminent sense if you understand the disciplines and the skills that go into doing that. And we have agencies that have done that. But what we see today is an increased commoditization across the market, and the concern is that's what would bleed across, and people's presumptions would therefore be incorrect.
And of course, implicit in that is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's almost human nature, and that without some kind of formal intervention or processes that guarantee that more complicated issues are handled in a more complicated, broader way, that is the atrophy that we're going towards, or that is...
Potentially that's true. And again, on the other hand, if we think about the government workforce, the pressures they're under today, all the budget reductions and budget uncertainty they face, almost all they hear now is drive your costs down, drive your costs down, drive your costs down. We make short-term investment decisions and no consideration for long-term cost impacts because it's all about that immediate budget and those budget pressures. And so they're getting conflicting direction and conflicting information also.
I would, just on that note, I would suggest that requirements development and improving requirements development for complex, services, integration efforts is vital at this point more than ever, given, the budgetary constraints we're operating under. You've got to get more value for money. It's not about low price. It's about our well-articulated requirements.
Ranking Member Ming, please.
Mr. Soloway, in your testimony, you discussed how strategic sourcing incorporates the full spectrum of procurement techniques outlined in the FAR. However, you indicate that while the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council understands it, that's not the case with those who are actually implementing the initiatives. Why do you think this disconnect exists?
Yeah, the only qualification I would give is the people who are going to be asked to implement in a lot of ways, because it's just beginning to mature and roll out. Our organization does a survey of federal acquisition leaders every 2 years. We go out and talk to them and ask them, what's going on in your world? What are your biggest concerns? We just issued it's the 10th year we've done it, just a few months ago. And what we found was the same concerns come back to us from the acquisition leadership that they've been having for the last decade, which are our workforce doesn't have adequate training and skills in negotiations, in market research, in pricing. And if you think about the model of strategic sourcing, what really is at its heart, it's really good market research, It's really good negotiation, and it's really good pricing skills and understanding how pricing models work because, again, back to the point of value versus low price, smart pricing people know that 5 or 6% more might get you a whole lot more value down the road. It might be very much worthwhile. So we have a skills deficiency, and I, again, think that the workforce is often under conflicting direction. On the one hand, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the admonition from Secretary Kendall for the workforce to think. On the other hand, they're increasingly being driven into sort of a rigid, rules-based, check-the-block, lack of critical thinking process to the compliance regime and other issues that Trey and other witnesses have raised. So there's a multitude of issues. This is why our view as an organization, and it includes our small businesses, is that done right, strategic sourcing can be a terrific tool. But do we have yet the workforce ready to implement it broadly, particularly as you move up the chain of complexity?
Another question for anyone. GSA puts numerous upfront requirements on strategic sourcing vehicles that must be met if a business hopes to be awarded a BPA. These range from delivery method to reporting requirements. Do you believe that small businesses have the required capabilities or have the money they need to meet these types of prerequisites?
Ms. Ming, we think that many companies, not just the small businesses, of course, the scope and scale of their struggle is increased, but all companies trying to sell to the Federal Government face very significant burdens trying to meet the different requirements, even something as simple as information collection. We encountered a Paperwork Reduction Act request. It was an exemption that we filed. We opposed the exemption that was being granted because the government estimated that for contractors to comply with this one information requirement, it was going to cost them over $1 billion a year. There's huge costs in government requirements, and as I noted in my comments, we think that remains one of the significant challenges for any company trying to do business in the public sector.
Ms. Ming, I might add to those comments. I do think one of the things that small businesses and the government have going on here is really a non-compliant situation. These strategic sourcing vehicles generally are consolidated procurements. And there are certain rules that the government is supposed to be following. Most notably, the government is supposed to be conducting market research. They're supposed to be talking to small businesses and asking the questions that you just asked. There's supposed to be justification when they decide to consolidate the procurement. They're supposed to do a written justification. We're finding that these requirements are not being followed. So it's not really just a matter of training. It's a matter of compliance. And I think this is a very important point, that before these vehicles are put into place, robust market research and a justification are under the FAR are required to be completed. And I at least have some knowledge that those requirements are not being met.
With regard to government unique requirements, they are barriers to entry for businesses, and especially for small businesses. In the area, for example, of data collection, a lot of these strategic sourcing BPAs include robust additional data collection requirements. And data is not a free good. It costs the companies money to actually collect that data and report it back to the government. And often it's data the government already has. And they're essentially trying to shift the cost of that collection and report it back. Ultimately, I think the taxpayer pays. I mean, it drives prices higher, and it does reduce competition, create barriers to entry. And another area I think that hurts businesses of all types, but especially small businesses, is that there's sort of been a rollback of commercial item contracting, which was, the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act in 1994 established commercial item contracting. The idea was gain access to the commercial marketplace. Well, as the government has wanted to do since enactment, there's been a sort of a rollback and a layering on of additional unique government laws and regulations. That's a barrier to entry to small businesses. That increases costs across the Federal enterprise. And I think it's time, to Trey's comment, to take a wholesale look at the procurement system, and especially look at commercial item contracting, because the government is missing out on increased competition, access to small businesses, and better value. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Appreciate our panel being here today, and just have a couple of questions. Mr. Walden, you just kind of piqued my curiosity a little bit. I come from a construction family. You deal in higher tech information, but I can't help but recall a few years back, part of the construction project was going to be in the Forest Service. And they were building, for lack of a better description or a nicer description, a comfort station. And because of government-specific requirements, they had to get special equipment to be able to build effectively a comfort station. Do you think that we're making some real challenges for ourselves in terms of the government getting unique in requirements when we could certainly streamline that and be able to take advantage of products that already exist?
Absolutely. That's the whole genesis and reason for being of the GSA Schedules program. It's supposed to be a commercial item contracting program, and it provides the government with the opportunity to leverage the commercial marketplace. The companies doing business out there in the commercial marketplace, they know what they sell. They know what requirements are. And the problem is, to your point, is the government layers on unique requirements, whether it's statutory regulatory compliance requirements or even unique requirements and functionality that nobody in the commercial marketplace would do. And it does drive up costs. And I don't think we can really afford it anymore.
Appreciate that. That's a little bit of a paradox. And Mr. Soloway, you might want to be able to speak to this as well, because I think that point is well taken. When you were talking about unit cost, versus value and performance. Would you say that when we're getting these unique requirements that are going to be put up, are we getting more value and performance? We may, in a very unique sense, I guess, be able to drive down the costs, but at the same time, as Mr. Walden is indicating, we're actually driving up costs on the other side.
Well, I think that's a critical element, and I think his point about the backsliding since the mid to late 90s when we were implementing the reforms to the system, creating more access for commercial companies is really at the heart of a lot of this. Some of the unique requirements are probably unavoidable given the agency oversight responsibilities, congressional oversight responsibilities, and so forth. So some of it is a sort of understood, accepted form of doing business, but the point of the commercial items changes was to reduce those unique requirements, to accept, for instance, commercial audit reports rather than giving government unique audit access or cost accounting standards that are very different in the government than they are in the commercial world and so forth. So that has changed, and it does drive up costs. I'd suggest that one of the biggest issues that we have today, unfortunately there are cases of it at GSA, but it's also in other agencies, is a dramatic expansion of audit requirements. Now, I want to be really clear that no company doing business with the government, particularly companies that are working on other than fixed price contracts, can be surprised that they're going to be audited. The government has a right and a need to make sure that the cost submissions are correct and so forth. But the expansion of audit authority and frankly the quality, which has come down while the expansion has gone up, has been really dramatic. One very, very quick example, when you were working on a GSA contract, and Roger will correct me if I get the technical details wrong, when you go to renew your contract, the government has a right to see certain information to make sure your pricing is fair and reasonable and that the government's getting the best possible price. That does not mean the government has access. In fact, the rules specifically state they don't have access to your entire book. And if you're a large commercial company, they can't come in and review all of the corporate books. Leaving small business aside, for whom that can be an issue, I know two very large companies that have come very close to walking away from their GSA schedule contracts because their corporate boards have said, we do not show our internal books to anybody. I mean, it's a commercial practice. So there's been an expansion and a growing intrusion by the audit community for a return on information and quality that I think is very specious. So we're past the point of the value and benefit of oversight to added cost with very little value coming back in return.
Appreciate that. And Mr. Hodgkins, I'm about out of time, but I was very curious in your testimony. You talked about a lot of businesses simply because of the complexity were just simply walking away. They wouldn't even participate. And are there some recommendations, and I think Ms. Soloway just probably spoke to it a little bit, sorry losing my voice, that some of the audit requirements and that, what could we do to make sure that we've got a better playing field and are getting people excited about having that opportunity to be able to create jobs?
Well, I think between us here at the table, we could probably come up with dozens and dozens of examples where there are challenges or divergences from the ordinary commercial business models that most of these companies operate under. One that many of our members have experienced over the last year and a half is dealing with end-user license agreements on software. And I think there was pretty uniform agreement in the legal community that the license agreements were adequately designed so that the government rights were protected, and that the things the government was asserting and asking for revisions under those agreements was already taken care of. But what many companies have had to do is go through a very lengthy and bureaucratic process with GSA and actually revise the commercial license that you accept when you buy an operating system or a game for your child. Those things have all had to be revised if those products are to remain on a GSA schedule. It's been a very costly exercise, and it's an example my community recently experienced where we have a significant divergence from the normal commercial practice that costs a lot of money for the government and the companies to make the products remain available.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. So what we have here is kind of an exercise in the obvious, right? Price is definable, discernible. You can see it on a page. Everything after that, there's a disincentive to provide a more complex, subjective, even though we would prefer value being the end result, not dollar signs, because value is the ultimate goal. We have a system that it reinforces what we would expect, and that is that nobody was ever punished for buying something at the cheapest possible price, but there is associated risk with using one's subjective or imaginative or experientially based process in coming up with something different. Do you agree that that's kind of fundamentally maybe what's going on here?
Mr. Chairman, very much so, but I wanted to add one point which I don't think has been covered, and I think it's a fundamental point and maybe something that would not readily be identifiable. I think there is a benefit to having more than one strategic sourcing vehicle in the government for any particular commodity or service. There seems to be a trend right now to be going to a single vehicle and make it mandatory. I think that this will be a mistake for the government for a number of reasons, some that I've already addressed. But the point that has not been addressed is that there's actual benefit to competition among vehicles within the government. I mean, you don't want 500 of them, and the government does have a tendency to have too many of these consolidated procurements, but you do want more than one. And we found that the competition among agencies with respect to vehicles was very productive. It resulted in innovation, efficiencies, best practices to be shared among agencies. And so I would encourage the government to make sure they don't go to a mandatory single procurement vehicle.
But,
and I think
Mr. Burton,
competition.
you were involved in the government's initial strategic sourcing effort, and I understand that you were also involved in the 2003 effort to stop bundling. Can you talk a little bit about the tensions between strategic sourcing and bundling and how you think they might be resolved, or was that part of your explanation?
No, well, very much. I mean, that's obviously a highly related topic, and we did try to address what we called unjustified bundling. There's a legal distinction between bundling and consolidated procurements. Bundling basically involves a determination that a certain commodity or service is simply unsuitable to be provided or performed by a small business. And so that's a high threshold to make that determination that something's simply unsuitable, that small businesses simply cannot perform or provide the commodity or service. But consolidated and bundling procurements both require an analysis and justification of why you're pulling these requirements together in one procurement, and also both require market research. We found that bundling is a very difficult topic to try to get your hands across. Basically, agencies have done a poor job in justifying bundled contracts. And what we were trying to get to, sir, back in that period of time was to make sure those justifications were done. Make sure if that you were going to do a bundled contract, which basically saying small businesses can't participate. What we're dealing with here with the strategic sourcing vehicles are consolidated procurements, not bundled procurements. And so there are set-asides for small businesses, recognized that these services and commodities can be provided by small businesses, which is good. So, that is very important, but the problem is just ensuring enough small business participation. And it was a very difficult initiative. One of the things we did with the bundled initiative was try to ensure that if an agency did have a justification for a bundled procurement, and if they decided that small businesses could not participate, then there were some type of mitigation actions they took. For example, ensuring that prime contractors enforce their subcontracting plans, which might involve some type of small business participation. And this is an area I think the government needs to focus on, is trying to enforce subcontracting plans by the prime contractors to ensure that small businesses, in fact, have some role to play.
So that along those lines, Mr. Walden, the Jan-San draft request for proposal states that the GSA is seeking to have FSSI winners become exclusive providers to the defense commissaries. So that must concern you. Or does it concern you, I guess, is a more appropriate way to.
Yes, it does concern me. Again, as I indicated in my testimony, the idea of mandatory use it restricts ability of small businesses to compete. It closes the market. It reduces the market to a limited number of contractors. And I also think it's not in the government's best interest. It creates risk for the government from this perspective. Back in the dark ages when I was at GSA in the 90s, GSA schedules were a mandatory source. And ultimately, various agencies decided to use other than GSA contracts for court reporting, for example. Led to a series, and that was a breach of those contracts, and that's a breach of the agreement. They're putting it in the solicitation. You're going to be an exclusive source. Ultimately, the government ended up having to pay millions of dollars to various GSA scheduled contractors for that breach. So again, mandatory use restricts competition. It creates risk for the government. Much rather see real volume commitments or for real requirements.
So the ultimate outcome is to reduce competition by single source or very low number of sources in the long run, which also in the long run raises prices. So that it's safe to say then generally, and anybody disagree with this, that within the context of everything we do, we need to foster competition broadly, deeply, and with the idea of creating more businesses, not reducing them.
Well, that's the GSA schedules is a perfect example. It was mandatory, had maybe a couple thousand contractors in the early 90s, and $3 or $4 billion was going through the program. Today, the program accounts for $50 billion in purchases on an annual basis. There's literally 20,000 companies who have contracts, both through the VA and through the GSA schedules, competing every day for requirements, competing at the task order level. That makes your point. It's a competitive marketplace. It grew when it was made non-mandatory, and the process was streamlined, and we went to commercial item contracting.
Thank you. Ranking Member Ming? Thank you very much for your testimony today. If there are no further questions for this panel, I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and excuse the panel. The second panel may now be seated. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Our next witness is Mr. Joseph G. Jordan. Mr. Jordan is the administrator at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, which provides overall direction for government-wide procurement policies. Previously, Mr. Jordan served as the Associate Administrator of Government Contracting and Business Development at the SBA. Mr. Jordan, you may begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Meng, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss initiatives the administration is taking to both save money and maximize small business participation in federal procurement. These efforts are central to the government's ability to get the best value for the taxpayer. With approximately 1 out of every $7 the government spends going to contractors, it is imperative their acquisition processes enable us to get the highest quality goods and services for the lowest possible cost. Equally important, our processes must allow us to regularly tap into the creativity, innovation, and technical expertise that small businesses offer. The good news is that I believe both buying smarter initiatives like strategic sourcing and maximizing small business opportunities play together to maximize the value for the taxpayer. Prior to becoming Administrator for Federal Procurement Policy, as you said, Mr. Chairman, I served as Associate Administrator for Government Contracting and Business Development at the Small Business Administration. In that role, I was charged with increasing small business federal contracting opportunities. I'm proud of the progress that SBA made during my tenure to help agencies increase opportunities for small businesses as we drove the largest 2-year increase against the small business contracting goals in more than a decade. These efforts included partnering with Congress, including this committee, on the historic Small Business Jobs Act. Supporting small businesses is especially important during this critical time as agencies strive to meet mission needs within increasingly tight budgets. From fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2012, agencies reduced contract spending by more than $20 billion, the largest single-year dollar decrease in federal contract spending on record. Over this same period, with strong leadership attention, agencies were able to increase the percentage of eligible contract dollars awarded to small businesses. My experience at SBA reinforced my belief that small business contracting is a win-win. These businesses get the revenue they need to create jobs and grow the economy, while the government gets access to some of the most innovative companies in our supply chain. Our efforts to identify better buying practices that save money and increase opportunities for small business led us to place greater emphasis on strategic sourcing. Strategic sourcing, which the private sector has long recognized as a successful business practice, requires agencies to bring their spend under management. Efforts to date illustrate the substantial savings that strategic sourcing offers. Government-wide strategic sourcing of items such as office supplies and domestic shipping services have achieved nearly $300 million in direct and indirect savings since fiscal year 2010. And agency-level strategic sourcing of goods like IT and medical equipment have saved hundreds of millions more. Equally important, these efforts demonstrate that agencies can increase their spending with small business and simultaneously reap the benefits of strategic sourcing. We are not seeking to strategically source everything the government buys, nor will every strategic sourcing decision mean fewer participants. The goal is to maximize value for the taxpayer, and that will take different forms depending on the commodity being purchased and the government's cost drivers in that space. Our government-wide strategic sourcing of office supplies is a compelling example. 13 of the 15 winning vendors are small businesses, including 3 service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. According to GSA, total dollars going to small business increased from 67% prior to implementation of the strategic sourcing solution to almost 80% now. Many small businesses express concern that strategic sourcing could harm their participation in the federal marketplace. However, the administration is working to ensure that competitive small businesses can engage in strategic sourcing, and I am confident that these businesses, of whom there are many, will not only hold their own, but do even better. And those small businesses that are currently less competitive will have opportunities to get in the game in the future by taking steps to strengthen themselves. There are several additional things that the administration is doing to increase opportunities for small businesses at the same time as we work to maximize the value of strategic sourcing. First, agencies are required to seek increased participation by small businesses when pursuing strategic sourcing. Last December, OMB issued a blueprint for improving acquisition through strategic sourcing, which specifically requires that all proposed strategic sourcing agreements must baseline small business use under current strategies and set goals to meet or exceed that baseline participation under the new strategic sourcing vehicles. Secondly, government-wide strategic sourcing decisions will be made by a council that includes the Small Business Administration, so small businesses are ensured of a seat at the table. Third, We are actively promoting the use of tools such as those provided by the Small Business Jobs Act to facilitate greater small business participation on contract vehicles that have been strategically sourced. OFPP is committed to ensuring that agencies remain vigilant in their efforts to buy smarter and achieve best value for our taxpayers. OFPP is equally committed to ensuring that agencies provide maximum opportunities for small businesses in federal contracting and subcontracting so that they may flourish and apply their talents to the many pressing demands facing our government. We must pursue these important goals in harmony, as we have been doing and will continue to do. I'd be pleased to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Our next witness is Mr. Jeff Kosis. He is the Director of Acquisition Operations, which manages a large portion of the scheduled programs at the General Services Administration, and he is the business line leader for the multiple award schedule. Mr. Kosis, you may begin.
Good morning, Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Ming, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss GSA's accomplishments under the Federal Strategic Sourcing Initiative, or FSSI, and our efforts to modernize the Multiple Awards Schedules program. As America's buyer, GSA contracts with the private sector to provide commercial services and products that support federal agencies. We strive to acquire the best possible deal for the taxpayer and to increase small business opportunity. For many years, strategic sourcing has been a best practice in the private sector. The Government Accountability Office has found, in a series of audits, that the federal government can save billions of dollars through the application of strategic sourcing principles. A 2012 OMB memo on strategic sourcing, amongst other things, directed GSA to establish 10 new strategic sourcing solutions, 5 each in 2013 and 2014. GSA is working closely with OMB and the agencies making up the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council, including the Small Business Administration. FSSI seeks to leverage the federal government's collective buying power in order to efficiently and effectively utilize taxpayer dollars and to increase dollars spent with small business. There are 4 primary benefits associated with strategic sourcing: reduced costs per unit, decreased consumption, improved operating efficiency, and improved focus on socioeconomic goals. The Office Supplies, or OS2 solution, has served as a test case for this generation of federal strategic sourcing. OS2 has resulted in direct savings of $88.7 million on spending of $607.9 million through April 2013. This savings is calculated as the difference between what agencies spend through strategic sourcing and what they would have spent had they received the non-strategic sourcing prices. OS2 provides greater pricing transparency. OS2 contractors report transactional data on all program sales. This information provides us insight into agency spending behavior. GSA has used this data to show their contractors pricing item by item. After GSA shared this data, every one of the OS2 contractors sharply reduced their prices, a potential savings of over $12 million annually beginning this month. Key successes of the OS2 program include an increase from 67% to the high 70s dollars spent with small business, a decrease from more than 250% to 10% price variability, a reduction in contract duplication and administrative costs. GSA is working towards establishing strategic sourcing solutions for fiscal year 2013 in the areas of wireless rate plans and devices awarded last month, large desktop publisher software, print management, phase 2, maintenance, repair, and operation supplies, janitorial and sanitation supplies. When we research a potential solution, small business impact is foundational. Acting Administrator Tangherlini has made clear expanded opportunity for small business is a crucial strategic sourcing success metric. It's one that will be monitored closely. For both the janitorial sanitation supplies and the maintenance, repair, and operations supplies, we are setting aside the majority of awards for small business, and we broke the categories down in ways that maximize small business opportunities. GSA believes the Multiple Awards Schedules program represents the best opportunity for well-prepared, highly competitive small businesses in government procurement. Small businesses represent about 80% of all scheduled vendors, and about 34% of the dollars go to small business. More importantly, most agencies have a higher percentage of spending with small business when they use schedules. Still, we believe there is substantial room for improvement in the Schedules program. Over the last year, we've worked diligently with both small business and federal agencies, asking for input on how the Schedules program can better meet their needs. We received and are working to implement many of the important suggestions we've heard. Similarly, we're eager to hear your input as we work to achieve taxpayer savings and grow small business success. One area of such success is our training in the discretionary set-aside rule, a result of Section 1331 of the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. To date, we've trained more than 9,700 members of the acquisition workforce on proper use of schedules and utilization of small business. Since last April, we've seen nearly 16,000 requests for a quote, 19% set aside for small business through GSA's e-buy system. For the month of April, this increased to 22.5%, great progress as the buying season kicks into high. As we look to the future, GSA will continue to focus on strategic sourcing, modernizing the Schedules program, improving our pricing and tools, collecting the information and data that will help save taxpayer dollars. GSA will continue being a leader in opening dialogue with industry, and our program will remain a doorway to opportunity for highly competitive small businesses. On behalf of GSA, thank you for this opportunity to appear before the committee, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Well, you gentlemen sat here through the previous panel. It sounds like something that should be more of a debate than a panel discussion, because clearly there's a large difference of opinion between what you believe you're producing and the direction you're going and the direction that the previous panel feels you're going. I have a transcript from a recent Jan-San MRO Industry Day at which you had employees representing your office. I'd like to ask you whether their statements are accurately reflect the position of your office, to be fair. First, staff suggested that the Jan-San and MRO contracts would become mandatory sources for the winners of future service contracts. I'm concerned that such an approach would decimate the subcontracting market as well as the prime contracting market. Do you support the making of Jan-San and MRO contracts mandatory for other federal agencies? And federal contractors, rather. Further, OFPP staff suggested that anyone who didn't develop a Jan-San or MRO contract could simply sell something else to the government, which I find particularly strange and troubling. I'm hoping that you understand the challenges these industries are involved in, and this isn't making it any easier for them. Perhaps either of you would like to comment on that, maybe Mr. Jordan first.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the comments themselves, it's difficult for me to, without context, react to them one by one. What I will say is in terms of, I think what you're getting at is concerns around potential mandating of vehicles, whether it's Jan-San or any of the future vehicles that are strategically sourced. OMB guidance, which we put out last December, does clearly say the vehicles that agencies create and that the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council approves should be mandated when appropriate. And I think that is important. I think that, not speaking to Jan-San specifically, because I think there are still steps to go, and Jeff can talk about where GSA is in the leadership of that particular commodity category, but overall, strategic sourcing in certain categories, it's different in every category, what's going to be the cost driver, the savings driver, like I said. But in certain categories, it is about ensuring that the government buys not as 300 mid-sized businesses and get pricing accordingly, but buy as what we are, the largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. And so in those commodities where you can really leverage our scale, you can drive significant taxpayer savings by getting volume-based discounts, we want to do that. And you only do that if you put in all that time and give the winners the spend that they agree to. Now, there's a number of ways to do that. There's tiered pricing as opposed to some of the guarantees you talked about. There is just overall good commodity management principles. But I do think that in certain categories, in order to maximize the value of these vehicles, it is appropriate to mandate their use.
For example?
I think without getting into any specific commodity, because we haven't gotten to the maturity level, I mean, this effort is in a crawl, walk, run
But it's
phase.
a subjective process by definition. I think, maybe not. Certainly a lot of it is. Who decides and how do you decide what is appropriate or isn't appropriate? And, you know, that process.
Sure. I think there are two things. One, as I mentioned in my testimony, a significant piece of strategic sourcing is done at the agency level, where currently you have various components or offices within the same agency with different contracts with the exact same vendor for the exact same products at wildly varying pricing, sometimes different terms and conditions. And if that agency stands up an agency-wide and enterprise-wide agreement, they would expect that their various components use that as opposed to create duplicative and potentially less optimal agreements and put their spend through that. Secondly, on who makes the decision on these government-wide vehicles, it's the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council, which is comprised of the 7 largest spending agencies who collectively spend about 92% of our.
What is your role on that leadership council? Will OFPP have to approve any FSSI initiatives? Has your office approved OASIS or OASIS SB, JAN, SAN, and MRO?
Okay, let me see if I got
a
all
few
of them.
acronyms in there, I know.
Yeah, I'm with that. Let me go in order.
Okay.
I tried to mentally capture all that. What is my role? I'm the chairman of the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council. Will OFPP approve the vehicles that are submitted? Yes, and there's a 3-stage process with key decision points at each stage. First is we say, somebody on the council will say, or maybe an outside member, will identify potential opportunity. We think there's an opportunity for strategic sourcing in commodity area or service area X. And we will say, yes, you've presented enough data to show there may be an opportunity. We form a commodity team comprised of the Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council members as well as non-SSLC agencies that have considerable spend. Again, SBA is a formal member of the SLC and participates in all this. The commodity team then does analysis and says, we think that there is a particular solution. It may be a new contract. It may be driving more utilization through a current or set of current vehicles, or it may simply be standardizing terms and conditions. And we would say, yes, that sounds like the right agreement. The SSLC would make that decision. They would then, if it is a new contract, which is, I think, where your question was going, they would engage with the vendor, and that's where it's important that the vendors are bidding based on some understanding of what volume they're actually going to get. You know, that's where it differs from the GSA schedule that you heard a lot about. The prices on the GSA schedule are simply ceiling prices or, you know, list prices. You would never walk on the dealer's lot and say, yep, I'll take that car for what it says in the window. You would negotiate. Well, we want to try to have some of that pre-negotiation based on not you buying one car, but us buying a fleet. And so that's where you would do that pre-commitment.
But you understand the concerns of the previous panel. If you continue to buy your fleet from that group, yes, eventually you'll run out of the opportunity to enjoy competition from other groups because you will have effectively, because you control so much of the marketplace, eliminated the opportunity to have competition sometime down the line.
Yes, very fair point.
So I mean, you generally agree with the previous panel in terms of their concerns in the long run.
I believe the first one of the panelists said it best, where strategic sourcing is absolutely a good thing. And as I believe your statement said, but as your statement said, it is a tool. If it's used well, it is a good thing. If it's used not well, it will not be a good thing. And so it's important in any of these categories to understand the market dynamics and do exactly what you say. What is the right set of vendors to have on a vehicle? Then what is the right period for that contract to cover such that anybody who was unsuccessful at the beginning, especially small businesses, have a chance to recompete and get back on, but we give enough volume to the winners that it justifies the low price.
Do you believe that the people within in purchasing and acquisition have the latitude to be comfortable to understand the dynamic differences between value and purchase price, value being total of everything, including purchase price, and how do they enjoy that latitude? How do you reinforce that if you do?
Yes, I believe that the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, gives them the right latitude to choose whichever method is appropriate in a particular procurement, be it low price, technically acceptable, or best value. I think that, like with everything, it's important to do training around understanding how to make that decision.
We've heard there's a lack of training or a lack of understanding about what that means.
Well, we always want to do we always want to increase both the quality and the and effectiveness of our training, and we work very hard with the Defense Acquisition University and the Federal Acquisition Institute to do that. One of the important points of strategic sourcing is, again, having an enterprise view of a commodity category so that we don't force numerous contracting officers to engage in a one-off contract, creating potentially duplicative and different terms and conditions in their contracts.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I have a question for Mr. Jordan. The plan for the new OASIS contract divides the requirements into two different contracts, one for large businesses with subcontracting goals and another exclusively for small businesses. However, this vehicle appears to be another attempt to disguise contract bundling, as the structure prevents small businesses from competing for half of the contract, which is valued at $10 billion. Why or how can OFPP step in to ensure that small businesses have greater access to this contract?
Well, I'll let Jeff speak to OASIS. It's not one of the SSLC covered vehicles at this point, so I don't have perfect insight into how it's being created or those types of things. I can speak to your question about how is OFPP looking to ensure that we don't have bundling and we incorporate the right strategic sourcing principles. Bundling, as was said in the previous panel, is pretty clearly defined as taking two or more contracts that have been or could be performed by small businesses and putting them together into a contract that is no longer suitable for small business performance. As we've seen in all of the vehicles we've done thus far, that is just not true. Office supplies, if it were bundled, would mean no small business participation. Instead, we saw small business participation go up from about 2/3 to over 3/4. Wireless is a good example of where all of the vendors originally, before strategic sourcing, were large businesses. We were able to carve out the wireless telecommunication expense management services, a piece of that business where small businesses could handle it, and we elevated them to have a prime level on that. So we would like to apply those same sources across the board. In any vehicle, or in many vehicles, I guess I should say, there's likely a whole bunch of the requirements that small businesses can do, and there are potentially some that they cannot. And so it's okay to have a mix of small and large businesses in the supplier pool in any of these categories, as long as when two or more of the small businesses can do it, we're using that. And that's where the Section 1331 set aside that Congress gave us, that authority, has been very helpful, and we will continue to push that. It's where the small business goals and SBA's dashboard and goaling report scorecard is very helpful. And obviously, given my background at SBA and MIC at OFPP, we care, I care personally, and we care as an office passionately about ensuring that we can both save money and increase the small business utilization.
Thank you. Mr. Kosis, under GSA's proposed Janssen and MRO vehicles, 15 vendors will receive BPAs. While the majority of these have been set aside for small businesses, the number does not begin to include the thousands of businesses that currently contract with the federal government in those industries. While GSA has indicated that more businesses might be on-ramped to the Janssen, there's been no firm commitment by GSA as to when that will and if will occur. So can you definitely state whether or not more businesses will be added to the contract, and when in the duration of that contract will it occur?
Absolutely. And may I take the OASIS question first and then also answer the Janssen question? In terms of OASIS, we have put tremendous effort and focus on the key point that Mr. Burton raised earlier, that of a robust market research industry engagement strategy. Key to us has been ensuring that we remove geographic barriers and have a very broad outreach. We have used an internet-based platform, GSA Interact, featuring weekly blogs from the program manager, featuring several opportunities for one-on-one meetings between industry and government leaders, and 2 different rounds of white papers, trying to ensure that we have actively listened to small business, and not just GSA, but the agencies working with us to create the vehicle. And so with well over 100 one-on-one meetings with industry, we specifically talked the question, what is the best small business strategy? We had that conversation with SBA as well. and overwhelmingly that message was, we want to see two different vehicles, one set aside for small business, one not. We wanted to see a crossover feature, because part of what we're after is wildly successful small businesses under OASIS. And if some of them outgrow the size standard, they now will have the ability to cross over to the OASIS Prime vehicle. We've tried to use that same type of an engagement strategy throughout our FSSI efforts as well. Again, we have used GSA Interact to create internet-based chat rooms to discuss, to define, to pursue the goals. We've had our program managers doing weekly chats, trying to bring industry to the table and hear and identify these small business issues, and trying to ensure that the different federal agencies have been side by side with GSA, listening to those industry messages. In both of those cases, we've posted a draft request for or draft solicitation. The purpose of the draft is to get comment, to get feedback, because we don't pose that we know all the answers. We are putting out what the best information we've had, and we're asking for validation, for correction, for suggested improvements. We heard definite suggestions for improvement in OASIS. We heard suggestions for improvement in JANSAN and MRO. We did hear messages that 15 was the wrong number of vendors, and we've had that conversation with the commodity team. When we post the revised solicitation this summer, the number will be marginally higher than 15. We're still finalizing, but we've gotten the sense that we didn't define the groups and the breakdowns exactly correctly. We don't have the exact number of vendors, but we're in the general neighborhood.
In general, for either witness, how do you perceive the balance between the goal of saving the federal government money and the desire to contract with small businesses? I believe that it's essential that GSA work with small businesses and reach the 27% goal, but I also understand in the short term the costs of these contracts can seem higher. How can we ensure that we're striking the right balance?
On an overall perspective, I think that the goals of saving the taxpayer money and increasing our utilization of small business are absolutely mutually reinforcing. I've seen it over and over again that you can absolutely use small business and save money. It means buying smarter, standardizing terms and conditions, taking administrative costs out of the system. You mentioned earlier, Congressman, that when small businesses bid, they have those bid and proposal costs. If we can take some of that out of the system by not making them compete for all these duplicative vehicles, it can be helpful. We've seen it in office supplies. We've seen it in wireless. We've seen it in the market research we're doing on additional categories. So that's why I am a fervent believer that we can both save the taxpayers considerable amounts of money and increase our utilization of small businesses. Then, like I said, there will be, when you do this type of effort, there will be winners and losers. We need to make sure that ensure that those decisions are made in a transparent way, in a fair way, based on quantitative metrics that everybody understands. And then for the folks who are unsuccessful, not just leave them alone, engage in additional training, create the right on-ramps and off-ramps for the vehicles that have been set up, use all of the tools at our disposal to make those small businesses that were unsuccessful even more competitive next time. And that's how you reinvigorate the system overall.
In addition, we talked a little bit about the market research component. One of the core questions that we keep asking industry is, what is it that the governments do that's adding cost to the process? How are we buying that's more expensive for you? And how do we start changing that? And that leads to some very good conversations with the commodity team as we wrestle with what can we change and try and fine-tune and address some of our longstanding requirements. In our office supplies example, we recognized two big cost drivers that harmed small business were an overnight delivery time and a very low minimum order. Both of those were things we changed coming out of those conversations. In our print management solution, much like wireless, we were looking at an industry that had been dominated by large business, and we saw where small business could start playing a really critical role and help us save money in the process. We built a solution that we called a fleet assessment. It was all about trying to go in, get a handle on what solutions actually are there. What is the agency inventory? How much are we printing today? The biggest cost in printing is actually making that decision, hit the print button, run the pages through the machine. Well, we've learned through our industry engagement that we buy way too much, we buy too many machines, too much gold plating. And by creating that role for small business to do the fleet assessment, to help us figure out what is our inventory, what is our print behavior today, we're setting this stage by using small business for savings over time.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. It's somewhat of a declarative statement, but you feel free to answer it. If JanSan becomes mandatory, the 500-plus companies who do not win BPA's awards will not be able to maintain their contracts. They won't be able to make the required $25,000 minimum sales each year. So I ask you, what happens to these companies if that's the case, and what do you plan to do about it? If you want to say something fun, that would be great.
In our office supplies example, we've had sales under the schedule program that average about $700 million a year over the last 3 years. Collectively, in that time period, sales through FSSI have been about 30% of that total. We have not seen the entire market move over to the strategic sourcing solution. We frankly would like to see a lot more of it move over.
And it's not, office supplies, as you know, are not mandatory now.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. So you recognize there's a problem with that minimum, and that you may become your own worst enemy by effectively eliminating people from the marketplace that we want to thrive. And
I fully understand the concern, Congressman. We don't believe that this will ever be a 100% solution. In talking to agencies, we're talking about the core areas where we're targeting, and we would like to see most of the spend able to concentrate through that vehicle. But if we start saying every situation, no exceptions, no waivers, everything goes through this beyond the pale, we're going to create a program that doesn't make sense.
So what solutions are you working towards then?
We're working to define the core items that the government buys the most frequently or that are the most critical for operations. To start that with several thousand core items between the market basket and the extended catalog, to define what is the appropriate delivery time and ordering level. But recognize there's going to be exceptions. There's going to be the agencies that need something immediately, that require the overnight delivery, that require a low purchase or some other exception, and they still will have this schedule to choose from.
For the OASIS and OASIS SB contracts, understand that GSA is not allowing new small businesses teams to compete. As you know, the 2010 Job Act amended the Small Business Act to require that any solicitation for multiple award contracts above $2 million solicit offers from small business concerns and teams or joint ventures. Now, I've seen in the email that you sent our staff on that issue. However, I am having trouble understanding why, when the law is explicit, the GSA feels its contracting strategy is more important than the law. Could you please explain that rationale and how you intend to address it, Mr. Kosis?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. We believe that OASIS is being designed with the needs, with the interest of small business and small business opportunity in mind. We have tried to develop a very clear, a very straightforward concept and evaluation methodology. We believe central is, OASIS is about integration of professional services. So the contractors who will be successful will need to demonstrate that they have been able to integrate professional services, that they know how to do it, that they have the relationships. Not that they have to have them in place today, that they know how to set them up, they know how to make them happen. We are very confident that there will be a lot of teaming under OASIS. We're just saying you don't have to have your team created today. You have to show us you know how to create a team and that you have done so successfully.
How do they go about that if they're not already in the process? I mean, how do you encourage new businesses to engage in that? Or do you?
When we're talking about highly professional, highly technical integrated services that cross numerous disciplines, we think it's important that you be able to show us past success at having done so, that you have successfully integrated smaller projects, that you've successfully performed similar types of work. It will be very difficult for this to be a first government contract, but it will be a tremendous opportunity for small businesses to come in the door as team members, as subcontractors to the prime contract holders.
Of course, our interpretation would be that the law says otherwise. You understand that?
Chairman, we're confident that we're reading the law appropriately, but we look forward to continuing to work with your staff as we continue the market research.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. Are there no further questions? Okay. Let's see. Okay. I guess, we've sat here and we've heard this. It's been, I think, a productive 2 3/4 hours or 1 3/4 hours. Generally, I take that we're all here in earnest and that we want to produce the best value for the government, and that is, in and of its nature, a difficult thing to do because it is subjective. But to the extent that the goal of this committee is to broaden opportunity across a wide variety of disciplines, companies, et cetera, I think it's safe to say that we can agree that the elimination over time of competition through whatever means is not a goal that any of us share. So you've heard what the previous panel member said. I just ask that you commit to analyzing the long-term consequences of strategic sourcing and how it affects competition and small businesses and all that entails. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much for your time today. If there are no further questions for the witnesses, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and state that this is an issue the subcommittee will be continuing to monitor carefully. We owe it to the taxpayers to make sure we maintain a viable small business industrial base so that we can protect competition and innovation in federal contracting. I want to make sure that the strategic source contracts being proposed capitalize on all that small businesses have to offer in order to achieve long-term savings rather than focusing on short-term gains and savings over long-term growth and savings. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you all.